Chapter 37. Chalky mist pooled in the engine room, smothering the air with the scent of vinegar and forming specks of corrosive white crust on various portions of the walls and machines surrounding the power core. Magicite produced a similar byproduct, but never to such a great extent, and certainly never so quickly. Ashalia and her cortege struggled through the opaque puffs that intermittently choked their vision, taking refuge beneath a jutting platform where the mist bypassed them. From this vantage point, they surveyed much of the extensive engine, which consisted of countless chambers containing glowing stones, all pulsing a bright and horrendous red hue that seemed to turn the mist to blood. These engine cores stretched up and down the entire length of the ship, a winding case of grated metal stairs spiraling around them and somewhat flimsy catwalks providing closer access at various points. All in the cortege began to wonder at the soundness of their original plan, suspecting that sabotaging this ship may only worsen the ordeal outside and seal their own fates. The princess did not appear ready to easily change her mind, but her hesitance made itself known through her thinning veil of bravado. The threatening snarl of engines punctuated her expression, but she did not speak, looking over the labyrinth of machinery and the whirlwind of mist, narrowing her eyes and clenching her jaw, one hand resting on the hilt of Azela's sword. Fran dared to step forward from their hiding place, noting with her perceptive ears that the few guards present on the other levels could neither see them through the crimson clouds nor hear them over the thrum of machines. Feeling the bitter mist on her skin, sensing its deft taste as it permeated her lungs, she wrinkled her nose and struggled to better observe the swelling plumes as they freed themselves from the engines. This mist dissipated fast and left thick deposits of acerbic dust in its wake. It did not seem right, its fragrance devoid of the usual refreshing cleanness, its reflective qualities skewed in comparison to normal mist, the proportions more accurate, but the colors bizarrely reversed. "Strange," she said at last, raising her voice only high enough to reach her companions over the racket. "This mist does not have much feeling to it." The glint of suspicion darkened Balthier's eyes as well, though he weighed the elusive properties of the mist against science rather than sensation. "It's artificial," he said peevishly. Venturing forth slightly, the others glanced up and down at the massive system of valves, vaults, and pipes, realizing that everything from the glow to the intensity to even the temperature of the rising fog differed from the ordinary. Indeed, innumerable chunks of artificial nethicite powered the impressive vessel, working as efficiently as 4 or 5 times its weight in magicite. "I thought we got rid of all the nethicite," Vaughn protested, turning his gaze from the colossal hover apparatus to Balthier. "I mean, you said the fake stuff was only part of the real stuff, right?" The pirate showed little interest in the engine, shaking his head faintly in contemplation. "It's deeffacted nethicite fused with magicite, it should have died out with the sun crest. There should only be magicite left. Then Sid really did create something new altogether?" Bosch asked. Balthier's eyes grew intense, and he shook his head a bit harder. "He couldn't have." "Believe it or not, Balthier," Penello injected, "you have been wrong before. What if it's some sort of preservation system?" he suggested, taking a few slow, aimless steps. "The magicite protected the nethicite so it wouldn't be affected by the sun crest." Vaughn ran his eyes over the maze of machinery above. "So we just have to chop every piece of it open?" "That didn't seem to help at the Galtian shrine," Bosch replied sternly. Balthier continued pacing. "No, that couldn't be it." "You're thinking too hard," said Fran. He made something new, he went on. Not Nephesite, but not Magicite, either. It has to be a different kind of stone. You can't eliminate an ingredient and get the same reaction. They're similar, but they're not the same. Ash studied him intently, her eyes cloudy and opaque in the fiery light of the damp chamber. All of the de-affected Nephesite was connected somehow, she offered carefully. Destroying the source destroyed the shards. Couldn't that apply to the artificial Nephesite, as well? If they're so similar. It would have to, Balthier answered. They're cousins, after all, they're made of the same stuff. So, Fran added, where would Dr. Sid keep the original piece of his Nephesite? Vaughn groaned, leaning his head back and shutting his eyes. We don't exactly have time to go back to Arcades and search Drockler, said Bosch. What good would that do us, anyway? Ash continued. We've lost Rythwal's sword. Timidly, childishly, Penelo took a little emerald-hued shard of artificial Nephesite out of her pocket, holding it out helplessly. Monty said this was the first. Balthier resisted rolling his eyes, if only to keep from exacerbating the dismay that descended upon each of them. Ash had tested Rythwal's blade on that very piece of Nephesite to no avail. Then the sword wouldn't be much help, would it? He asked. So much for that idea, Vaughn sighed. It doesn't make any sense, though, Balthier insisted, running a hand through his hair and leaning against a wall. I went over the old bastard's equations myself, there was no other way he could have done it. Ash stared coldly at the Bahamut's engine. With Venat's help, there's no telling what he did. Venat! Balthier echoed with a growl. None seemed able to add anything useful to the discussion, and in that instant a shudder ran down one of the walls, muted within the confines of the corner in which they stood, but certainly thundering from inside the room adjacent. The group fell silent, bracing for the worst, hoping that a crate had fallen loose of its stack and nothing more. Just as they relaxed enough to brush it off as a typical operational noise of the grand ship, the faint chime of swords meeting rang through the air, audible even over the rush of engines, spurring a surge of urgency in each of them. We're busted! Vaughn whispered skittishly. The clanging again ceased momentarily, and none dared answer in the silence. The engines whirred, and the group gathered closer in the alcove, listening with concentrated stillness. After a moment more, Ash spoke. We should go back to the straw. My thoughts exactly, Bosch replied. At once, the clamor started up again, this time far fiercer in speed and volume, each blow reverberating clearly throughout the metal walls, but softening against the din that filled the engine room. The noise seemed to carry from a small air duct near the platform above them, and although it proved far too tiny to admit passage into the next room, it clarified the clashing of steel unmistakably. Ash briefly wondered if perhaps it admitted the amplification of their voices into the next room, but they had heard no voice before or after the racket of battle, so she decided they yet remained safe. What the hell is going on? She huffed. Does it really matter? Asked Bosch. You're no good to Dalmasca. We should leave while we still can. Since when are you such a coward? Balthier interjected. Shut up. The reprimand came from both Ash and Bosch in unison, gleaning a nervous giggle from Penelo. We're checking it out, Ash said definitively, vanishing into the mist, heading for the nearest door.
Highness,
Bosch insisted, following after her,
either the ship's been breached or our plan's been uncovered. Either way, we have to lend a hand. Then we will, as soon as you're safe.
Pulling the door open quickly in an effective attempt to silence him, she glanced out into the halls and found them opportunely vacant. The others gathered in behind her, and after another moment's caution, she gestured them onward, moving quickly and quietly to the door of the next room, following the distant ring of steel and noting that the solid door prevented it from resonating too loudly in the corridor. The room beyond stored many crates of miscellaneous cargo, stacked into high towers and strapped down in an ominous jumble of ropes and netting. The princess and her cortege entered on a balcony overlooking the level below, though the grated metal stairway connecting the two floors remained sealed off by a flimsy but nevertheless protective expanse of wire mesh. A heavy lock clamped shut the only gate leading past it. None spared time to comment on the enclosure, however, for their attention quickly flew to the lower level, where they found Vayne and Gabranth dueling violently, swinging steel faster than untrained eyes could see, exchanging blows with growing force. Monty had regained consciousness and huddled on his hands and knees in the corner, coughing up blood. The sight spurred Penelo to action, drawing her sword and charging the gate leading down, hacking at it with all the force her tiny frame could muster, scantly denting the barrier. The others dashed to her aid, chopping through the wires, cursing the shameful pace of their progress, but only Bolthir noticed the princess turn and rush back out the door through which they had entered. Seeing the door on the opposite wall that led into the room's lower level, he immediately caught on to her half-witted impulse and followed after her, though he knew he would not catch her in time. She met no opposition in the hallway, but had drawn Azela's sword anyway, and he drew his own as she disappeared into the dark metal stairwell, praying that their luck might hold until he at least reached a range at which he might protect her. It only occurred to Bolthir as he and Ash descended the echoing flights of stairs that he may gain quicker access by picking the lock that closed off the balcony from the lower floor. But someone had to protect the princess, and it didn't appear as though Bosch or Vaughn even noticed that she did not join them in blindly attacking the gate above, and so he kept up his chase. The halls had proven deserted, the Bahamut's crew thankfully hard at work elsewhere, but it seemed likely that a fair number of soldiers would pass through on business, and if one should hear the ferocious clanging of metal and opt to investigate, their predicament would quickly worsen. As they burst through the door to the main chamber of the cargo hold, Ashalia did not even allow Bolthir the time to shout a warning to her before she leapt into the fight.
Vayne!
She caught his blade against hers and threw him off, then sturdily planted herself between him and Gabranth, sword raised only slightly in defense.
What's wrong with you? This isn't going to solve anything. And is that what you're here to do?
He growled in return.
Solve things.
Bolthir noted the exasperated expression of his companions on the balcony, but he could do nothing to help the situation now, and thus he raised his sword and stood ready to defend Ash.
We came here to negotiate, she insisted. Stop this nonsense and do what is best for your country. I'm doing what is best for the world,
the Emperor replied.
And what about what's best for your brother?
Monty knelt dizzily in the corner, yet unable to rise. His father's sword lay resignedly beside him.
He's better off dead than a puppet of Dalmasca.
Vayne snapped, and with his, he again took up the battle, striking fiercely at the princess while fending off Bolthir and Gabranth with expert skill. Above them, the rest of Ash's cortege broke through the wire meshing and made to join the brawl, but it did not last long enough to welcome their aid. Vayne threw Bolthir off, and although the pirate quickly rolled to his feet, the Emperor took the opportunity to thrust his sword upwards through the gap Ashe left while distracted by Balthier's welfare. She, too, fell to the ground, however, swiftly tackled by Gabranth. The resounding ring of steel against steel pierced the air, followed by a gritting sliding noise as Vane's blade came free of the judge's armor, blood glistening along the edge. Ashe struggled to stand, noting that Gabranth's sword had fallen from his grip as he pushed her away, and Balthier joined the others as they charged, but Vane's speed outmatched them all. Planting a boot on Gabranth's torso to hold him down, he raised the sword high, prepared to slice the judge's head clean off, but halted abruptly in mid-stroke, struggling to catch his breath. He glanced down wearily to see a blade protruding from his chest, and slumped to the left, sliding off the sword and landing with a thud beside Gabranth. Behind him stood Monty, pale and horrified, who dropped the sword with a wet clatter and frantically knelt at his brother's side, carefully pushing him onto his back, out of the growing puddle of blood. All others in the dreary chamber fell still and silent.
Vane!
The Emperor laughed with a bitter wheeze and weakly scruffed Lamont's hair.
Well done. I'm sorry.
He returned the gesture as best he could, but lacked the emotion.
Don't be.
Vane whispered.
I love you, Monty. I love you, too,
he replied deftly. All too simply, it ended, and profound silence overcame the room with a chillingly hushed intensity. The princess's cortege stood uncomfortably with bared swords lowered to their sides, and Gabranth sat dismally, hunched slightly, morosely unreadable. Monty grew very still, and Penelo wavered a bit, imperceptibly swayed on her toes, debating whether her affection and sympathy would meet gratitude or only greater sorrow should she express them. Ultimately, she decided against it. The boy didn't seem able to function for the moment, and if even Gabranth wouldn't touch him, then she presumed that she shouldn't, either. The fleeting moment of motionlessness seemed far longer until the subtle scrape of steel broke it. Only when Gabranth shifted did the passage of time return and indicate to them that mere seconds had passed. Gabranth knelt beside Monty, a bit of blood smeared on the metal floor where he had fallen, but he made no move to console the stunned boy.
Lamont,
Ashe offered at length, her voice soft.
I'm so sorry.
He looked up abruptly, but seemed to stare through her, beyond her, prompting her to turn. At her back, the air faltered, forming a mirror-like pane similar to the reflective surface of mist. Murky clouds darkened and grew, swirling blacks and purples into ripples of intangible flesh that seemed to swallow light as they solidified. Ashe drew back, Vaughn and Bosch flanking her protectively, but Lamont adopted a sharpened expression of curiosity, his gaze intensifying as at last the oily voice of Vina filled the room in genderless whispers.
Pay no heed to the despair that grips you, your brother would not wish it. We should rejoice in his liberation from the life of responsibility that burdened him. Leave him alone,
Ashe warned, blocking the creature's advance. Vina hovered in place, but did not cease her appeal.
He bore the strain of monarchy that you might live a life of freedom, but the stress would surely have overcome him in the end. Do not mourn for Vane, he is free of his own suffering at last, and you can see his mission done.
Monty continued to stare at the fluttering being uncomprehendingly while Penelo stepped to his side and Gabranth reclaimed his sword.
We are not your puppets, Vina,
said Ashe.
You have no more right to control our species than we have to control yours. Would you truly speak of puppets when in the same breath you speak for Lamont?
Vina countered calmly.
He can bring peace to our world, a privilege you forsook when you sold your allegiance to Garun.
Ash delivered one of her acute glares, but seemed lost for words, and Fran, who lingered with Bolthir at Vena's side, tilted her head back knowingly and spoke.
Perhaps if you and Garun would settle your own problems between yourselves, you'd have no need for human puppets.
Vena turned to glance at her with glowing gold eyes, her tone haughty and cool.
Perhaps we ought to hide away like the Viera and claim ignorance of the bloodshed committed by others. Better that than exacerbating it,
Fran replied.
The Aquaria ruled this world and the next for all the long years preceding the birth of mortal life.
Her color wavered, her density shifting as she addressed all present with a stronger hint of authority tainting her voice.
Our way has enveloped the world in peace before, but this time, it will last. The Evalician Alliance will gather all peoples under one law, and the life-giving breath of harmony will wash away this struggle's stain. You're delusional.
A quick moment of mild shock passed over them as each realized that Vaughn had spoken the words, his voice a firm scoff and his expression confident and challenging. Taken aback by the boy's audacity, Vena seemed to jolt subtly, her visage fading in and out of sight as wisps of smoke swirled about her amorphous body. Bosch mirrored Vaughn's resolve, speaking evenly and leveling a gaze of defiance on the creature.
We know our own limits better than you know our potential. You would do well to stop meddling. What insolence is this?
Vena growled, eyes burning an enraged orange. Briefly, while her bodyguards taunted Vena, Ash peered over her shoulder. Lamont remained kneeling beside Penelo, his eyes focused on the scuffed floor before him, unwilling to look at Vane's drained corpse, and Gabranth had ventured to lay a hand on his shoulder, which assured Ash that he would manage without her support for the moment. Now, turning to the Aquarian with renewed confidence, she spoke boldly.
Idealism fuels war far better than hatred, even we mortals know that. You haven't even the capacity to consider true unity,
Vena sneered.
You will not recognize it until it is achieved.
Bolthir nearly rolled his eyes.
Haven't you paid any attention in all these endless years you've been studying us?
He asked cockily.
Only a great fool would think humanity truly capable of such infantile nonsense as world peace. Well, in our current state, that is.
Vena spun to face him, alight with indignation, brimming with reflective smog, but the pirate continued on undaunted.
You didn't even know we were capable of understanding that much, did you? You thought we'd be easy targets, figured you'd better hurry and beat Garun to us. I rushed to earn your trust for your own good,
the creature insisted, subduing her tone and floating a bit higher.
To grant you the weapons you would need to protect yourselves in war with my kind. Garun and all your other Aquarian despots are long past, bound to the Sun Crest and rent asunder with it. By ridding this world of their ill-schemed reign, I have freed you from the tyranny of the gods and given you control over your own fates.
She advanced slightly, a tail of shimmering blue-hued mist trailing behind her.
Why not accept this gift on behalf of your long-oppressed species? Why rebel against me, and deny the liberation I offer? You've got quite a talent for sugar-coating things, don't you?
Bolthir replied.
You haven't liberated us, you've eliminated the competition and made yourself the only power behind the throne of a corrupt empire. I doubt you could possibly care less which human you set on that throne, so long as it's one who will act on your perverse counsel.
Vena seemed to morph suddenly, vanishing into darkness and appearing in the same instant several paces from her original position. Bolthir stumbled back slightly as she materialized before him, cornering him closely against a wall, releasing a plume of rich purple haze that dimmed the entire chamber.
You dare to slander the gods who have created and sustained you?
She flared.
Ignorance must be expected of your wretched breed, but sedition I will not permit."
The others advanced, blades readied, but Balthier seemed impervious, countering with his usual resentment.
"Drop the sham! You're no more gods than any of us, you're not even immortal." "Balthier,"
Ash said warily. Vina heaved upward once more, glowering down on him.
"Witless knaves such as you cannot hope to fathom my motives. Our reasoning is beyond your narrow scope of understanding. We should just sit back and trust that you're doing what's best for us."
He scoffed.
"Mind yourself,"
she hissed. He studied her for a moment, unimpressed by her display of mist and illusion, yet intrigued by her facade of godliness, her own misguided defense of her own erroneous grandeur.
"What exactly are you so afraid of?"
he asked, his tone bordering on admonishment.
"We can kill you more easily than you can kill us, can't we? It's those damned rocks, they're a part of you. Garon was bound to the Sun Crest, and you're bound to Sid's little abomination." "Silence, mortal!"
A subtle red tint began to rise in Vena's polished body, strengthening in vividness as it forced back the dark plum that usually punctuated her image. Balthier refused to relent, instead tossing his head subtly in the way a stag displays his rack when faced with challengers.
"That's why you helped him create it,"
he insisted, a small smirk of triumph adding clout to his words.
"It was the only way you could wipe out the rest of your kind without going down with them. Did you really think that would make you a god? You're a slave to the work of humans, we can destroy you the same way we destroyed the rest of your miserable species."
The flush of crimson intensified as a mocking laugh shuddered through the room, Vina fluttering threatening at the edges and mirroring his taunting tone.
"Do not place such faith in your derisory powers of assumption. Rythwal's treasonous blade was the only power in existence that could rend Nethysite from this world, and it has met its own destruction in fulfilling its purpose. I gave you Nethysite to free you, but if you will dare to use it without my counsel, it will surely raise your poor, primitive culture of egocentricity into utter obliteration."
As she spoke, she nudged forward just barely enough to garner notice, but Ash had tolerated enough and swung her sword, Azela's sword, through the creature's filmy body. It did no damage, as Ash had suspected, but it drew the creature's attention from Balthier to her.
"Stay away from him!"
The same elusive laughter resounded in her direction as the livid eyes settled on her.
"Ah!"
Vina jeered.
"Irrational to the end!"
Ash returned the smug glare.
"If you are truly a god and we are truly so contemptible, then perhaps you should have created us more to your liking." "What would you do, princess?"
she pressed, floating slowing toward her as she backed away.
"What strike would you think to make against me? You might hunt down and destroy our manufactured Nethysite, but our factories produce ever more and more of it by the day."
Bosch and Vaughn closed in around the princess, Fran joining them and Balthier circling around the creature's side. The group reached a standstill near the center of the metal chamber, but Ash refused to fall for another bluff offered up by a being that sought only to control her species. Reviewing all she had witnessed of late and drawing Garon's sword with one hand while sheathing Azela's with the other, she met Vena's eyes with bare inquiry.
"This sword?"
Vina flickered, her smoky frame flapping aquatically as she interjected.
"You have forsaken the assistance Garon offered you. That sword is powerless against me. It was forged by your own kind."
Ash glanced down at the shimmering blade, the light of realization illuminating the blue in her eyes.
"I'll turn it on the stones that preserve your life." You said I could destroy manufactured nethysite, didn't you? The only tool that ever held the power to destroy nethysite has perished. It destroyed deaffected nethysite.
The determination in the princess's voice struck them all, Penelo rising to her feet and Balthier once again daring to address Vina.
It cut the fake stuff in half.
Penelo stepped forward, wanting to approach her princess's side, but unwilling to leave Monty's. Her trembling hand fished in her pocket, pulling out the small shard of artificial nethysite while she asked tepidly.
It did what the other one was supposed to do.
Vina responded with a flurry of color, but Balthier spoke before she could.
The artificial nethysite must have mutated somehow in the fusing process, reversed itself. Naturally, the swords have the opposite effect. You jump to nonsensical conclusions.
The creature shouted.
You're scared,
Ash replied. Vaughn turned to his sister.
Penelo, hurry.
The skittering of stone against steel answered him, for Penelo had already sent the nethysite sliding across the floor toward Ash. The princess stepped forward to intercept it, raising her Aquarian blade high, and Vina lunged for the tiny dark stone as it halted against Ash's boot. The sword fell with a piercing ring, Ash lurching forward with the stroke as she drew her foot back to safety, and at once Vina reeled back, thrown down by some unseen force, her murky body crumpling into a ball as it soared back and then flattening wide as it struck the floor. The force of the blow reverberated throughout the chamber like a clap of thunder. The stone crackled and sparked, a blinding sphere of light erupting from the fissure rent through it by the sword, and they all drew back, eyes tightly shut, as roiling mist filled the room, blowing past them fiercely and then dissolving into the air like steam. The lamps that illuminated the room died abruptly, the ship pitching with a moan of lost energy, but soon enough the backup generators activated, and a wash of dim light returned as the air station stabilized itself. Moisture coated every surface, everyone present dripping and damp, but even this dried before their eyes, a hiss of evaporation accompanying the sensation. A ghastly black smear of soot scorched the floor where the minuscule stone had met its end, grim proof that the blade meant to cut deaffected nethysite could indeed destroy manufactured nethysite. Their job remained yet unfinished, however, for Vina stumbled forward, rising sluggishly from the floor, unable to hover to her usual height, pulling her formless tail along the metal panels behind her. Colors fluctuated throughout her body, a gamut of shades shifting and undulating, and she seemed to say something, but it came out vague and inhuman. Streams of smoke curled below and before her like limbs that dragged her forward. Her eyes dimly faded in and out of view, one bright while the other went dark, alternating hues. Ash looked to Balthier urgently.
Are you sure about this?
He shook his head.
Not in the least. That was only half of it.
Penelo injected.
We have to get rid of the whole thing.
All eyes immediately fell on Lamont, who had risen to his feet amid the chaos and now held the shard in question, eyes trained on Vina as she sagged raggedly toward him.
Lamont, please.
Her voice wavered in search of its lost strength, in search of the calmness with which she so easily gained the trust of humans.
You are emperor now. Think not of your power, but of your duty, you are a servant to your throne.
His eyes seemed darker, cold, and severe, but he said nothing as she struggled onward.
The means to deliver your homeland from danger and preserve its greatness lie within your reach. Safety for your people, prosperity for mankind, peace for all of Ivalice. This is all you want, is it not?
He tossed the little green piece of nethysite on the floor, where it bounced 4 or 5 times, tumbling to a halt in front of Ash.
I want my brother back.
The sword fell with a resounding thunder of finality, and a hail of sparks splashed up and out, followed by a blinding wave of pungent mist that once again soaked the room. The lights died once more as the remains of the artificial nethysite sizzled and dissolved, and a catastrophic groan of machinery sounded as the ship lurched, dropping abruptly from the sky for a few terrifying moments before its diminutive magicite engines powered up, keeping it at a precarious hover. All aboard fell to their hands and knees, and the lights returned to barely a quarter of their usual function, dim and flickering, stretching not even to the corners of the drab chamber. However, illumination came to them in the form of Venah's death throes, rainbows of colors assaulting their eyes, flailing wisps of glossy smoke twisting, elongating, reaching for any source of stability. Her lacquered form skewed and frayed at the edges, distorting like a thin patch of cloth pulled in every direction, and with a piercing screech of outrage, the Aquarian rolled into a ball of black mist and finally fizzled into oblivion, utterly extinguished. The ship's frantic rocking made it difficult for them to gain and keep steady footing, but Ashalia's cortege managed to stand, their shock falling behind their realization that they hadn't much time to escape.
Well, that was a good idea,
Balthier groaned, rising uneasily and dusting himself off. Vaughn stumbled slightly as a tremor shook across the floor, rattling the lamps and making them sputter amid minute bouts of darkness.
How long have you known the sword could do that? Oh, 5 minutes. I don't suppose we could discuss it later.
Bosch injected.
Right,
said Balthier.
The straw will be happy to see us.
The Bahamut seemed to keep aloft fairly well, but it now appeared unquestionably evident that the great air station was going down fast. Alarms sounded an order of evacuation, and the pounding of panicked footsteps rumbled in the corridors. While her pirates and bodyguards made for the door, Ash turned to Penelo, who lingered at the center of the room, watching Monty with a fragile and insecure countenance that Ash hoped did not mirror her own. Eyes empty and boots soaked in blood, the boy remained on one knee beside his brother's body, Gabranth kneeling next to him attentively, silent and bleeding. Ash neared Penelo's side, leaving the others staring at her pressingly from the door, and tried to speak. She didn't know what to say, and had hoped that words might just flow from her mouth if she opened it, but she received no such luck, standing dumbly, closing her mouth once more and clenching her teeth in dismay. Thankfully, Gabranth took note of the grave hush and placed a hand on Monty's shoulder.
Monty! We have to get out of here. I'm no better than him.
The judge gently pulled Lamont to his feet and turned to walk at his side, but found that his legs had unexpectedly weakened. His first step was as normal, but on his second he seemed to nearly collapse, gripping the boy's shoulder by instinct, but finding his strength before putting weight on him. Monty moved to brace him, but drew back when he noticed the streak of blood trickling thickly down his side, and, seeing the child's lower lip begin to tremble as he searched for words, Gabranth stood tall, ignoring the pang of heat that surged through his body, and said in his calmest voice,
"Don't worry. It's just a scratch."